I will be exploring the film genre of dystopian science fiction film through a Marxist scope by comparing Fritz Lang's 1927 film Metropolis and Alfonso Cuarón's 2006 Children of Men. My justification for studying these films is because, even though they were filmed nearly 80 years apart, they portray a similar depiction of a fragmented dystopian society affected by class discrimination. Metropolis is considered as a pioneering and foundational film in the sci-fi genre, as it represents a world that struggles between two crumbling societies, whilst Children of Men portrays a modern depiction of a decaying dystopian world that has descended into chaos and violence due to the power imbalance. However, ultimately both films foretell the inevitability of a broken social hierarchy. According to Professor Pamko, dystopian sci-fi films are a subgenre of horror and are viewed as a projection of humanity's fears at the time into the future. These fears are represented through a higher society gaining power as a result from class exploitation and the loss of individual liberties such as free expression. Therefore, the research question will be answered through three themes of fear projected by both directors: the capitalization and exploitation of a subordinate class system, the influence of dominant ideologies on society, and the increase in oppressive control and power of totalitarian governments. Metropolis is an expressionist sound film exploring the fragmentation and instability of the German social structure after World War I. Through its postmodernist cinematography, Metropolis projects the inner psychological trauma and institutionalized madness of German life following the war. These elements are visible in the stylized angles and the grim dystopian city of Metropolis. The high skyscrapers and integrated with advanced technology directly contrast with the chiaroscuro lighting in the industrialized and depressing city of the workers. This dichotomy between these classes depicts a rising society who uses its workers to benefit from their suffering, similar to Germany after the war. Due to the Versailles Treaty, Germany's initial defeat spiraled them into a period of terrible poverty and constant insecurity. These events led to the middle class bearing the brunt of the economic chaos, resulting in them growing weary and distrustful of their government leaders. Thus, as portrayed through the oppressive power and control of the bourgeoisie in Metropolis, these fears of the government's control and power festered into society. Similarly, Children of Men also depicts a grim prophecy of our current climate, a world reshaped by right-wing populism. This is because, according to philosopher Slavoj Zizek, it is easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. Being released only 5 years after 9/11 and filmed during the 7/7 London bombings, Children of Men imagined a crumbling society shocked by terrorism, ravaged by war, and stained by human rights abuses. However, the film focused specifically on the fear of hope being lost due to humanity's inevitable extinction. As 9/11 had a major impact on the religious faiths of many individuals, people started to question their faith in God and even lost it entirely because they could not reconcile with their views of religion anymore. This is portrayed in the film through the idea that after losing faith in one higher power, the British turned towards their government for guidance and salvation. Therefore, Children of Men addresses the fears of xenophobia and class discrimination getting out of control because totalitarian governments are gaining power to manipulate our ideologies and beliefs. Marxism is seen as a revolutionary form of liberty thinking that helps to analyze and recontextualize hierarchical relationships regarding social economic status. By reflecting the economic situation of Weimar Germany at the time through the narrative, Lang makes it clear how the Industrial Revolution had polarized the gap between the people in power and the workers. This can be seen through the isolated relationship between Friedrichsen and the working class. By creating this physical divide between the two classes, it symbolized the lack of human connection between German workers and the government at the time. This alienation is also visible in Children of Men through the physical barriers and solitary city separating the two classes. This isolation is further developed through a lack of identity and autonomy in the workers, as they were perceived to be literal working slaves with no personality. The symmetrical motionless shots convey this dehumanization, as the robot-like workers have been extracted so far away from their realities that they physically become one with the machines. In contrast, the bright lighting and spacious white shots personify the freedom of the Sun's Club. By cutting between these two contrasting scenes, Lang amplifies the conflict between these two worlds and criticizes the negative connotations of the Industrial Revolution in Germany. He does this to also convey that Germany's technological progression will continue to make mankind more and more machine, isolating workers from their humanity just for the benefit of the bourgeoisie. Similarly, in Children of Men, the government's exploitation is explored through the idea that unprecedented powers of the bourgeoisie allow them to invade the freedom and privacy of the proletariat. Therefore, Cuarón presents this traumatized world that is being exploited for their fears through this documentary-style cinematography. In a world where everything is controlled and confined, the camera is the only thing seen to freely move and follow the action. This documentative cinematography is also to place the audience directly inside the film's actions and experience firsthand the terrors of the world. Cuarón does this because the ability of individuals to think and act freely, imaginatively, and creatively has been crushed by omnipresent capitalist governments. Therefore, by minimizing close-ups and using majority-wide handout shots, Cuarón eliminates any main characters and blends everyone into one oppressive clustered society. Robert Stamp proposed the question, why did oppressed workers cling to a capitalist society which so clearly abused them? Antonio Gramsci suggested this is because of the bourgeoisie's dominant ideologies. The ruling class stays in power through hegemonic culture, a dominant set of ideas that aren't necessarily right or wrong, but are perceived to be so concrete that its basic tenets are unquestioned. An example in the films is self-censorship by the workers. Society and children of men is led to believe that in order for them to live a civilized life, everyone needs to surrender their rights and freedoms, as seen by citizens conforming to mandatory fertility tests and accepting government propaganda. However, these ideas aren't chosen by the citizens of Britain. They have been manipulated into becoming a new norm by being rooted into society by constantly being plastered around the city. However, in contrast to children of men, ideologies in Metropolis aren't forced or imposed. In fact, dominant ideologies are represented to the working class's acceptance of the situation, because for them their economic and hierarchical position has always been a social norm. This obliviousness and neglect of reality is called false consciousness. It describes the ways in which ideological and institutional processes are said to mislead members of the proletariat class, causing them to be exploited by the bourgeoisie. Nevertheless, Marx argued that when workers come to understand the totality of these factors, they would achieve class consciousness, and this in turn would lead to a workers' revolution that would overthrow the exploitative system of capitalism. However, ironically, in Metropolis, this inevitable uprising is revealed to be manufactured by Friedrichsen. Even though the working class escaped Friedrichsen's exploitative system, making him vulnerable to losing his control, he wanted them to realize that they needed his control over society to balance the social structure. He wanted them to realize that without him they would all fall into anarchy, causing death and destruction, therefore justifying the necessity for why his power structure existed. However, in the end it is he who becomes vulnerable and exposed, not the working class. He is the one being shunned into the light and held accountable for his actions. Like in Children of Men, this is visualized through the composition and shot angle as the power and political hierarchy is balanced. Everyone is kept on the same visual level. Through this, the director suggests that even though in society it is necessary to have a hierarchy that regulates social ideologies and keeps everything in control, equality and a sense of unity is imperative. The final fear the film focuses on is the total domination and control over freedom by a single class or government system. Both films visualize a deeply divided world that encourages the success of a small elite group at the expense of the rest of society, causing an enclave or a physical stratification to emerge. In Children of Men, this totalitarian regime is depicted through a centralized government that favors the economic and social hierarchy in their favor by neglecting refugees that are desperately looking for a way to survive. However, despite there being plenty of space where the wealthy live, the refugees are locked away in cages and alienated from any connection to society. Similarly, Metropolis' Sons Club also depicts this isolation through the city's skyscrapers towering on top of the working class, emphasizing the obvious social alienation. This ignorance and polarization between the rich citizens of Metropolis and the workers who live deep below the earth's surface, working in harsh, inhumane conditions, conveys the divide in privilege, also suggesting the bourgeoisie's misuse of power and lack of accountability has doomed an entire class of people. Similar to Friedrichsen, Nigel represents the hierarchical ideologies of a totalitarian government in a dystopian sci-fi film. However, Nigel's character is significantly more passive and negligent towards his responsibilities. When Theo asks him,
"What keeps you going?"
given the inevitability of mankind's extinction, Nigel simply replies,
"I just don't think about it."
This response embodies the principles and foundations of contemporary tyranny and the film's views of a world whose status quo can be maintained as much by outward oppression as it can be by utter apathy. The neglection of responsibility to preserve human life and human history in Children of Men could be a reflection of the real world and an aspect in our timeline that as a society we've shunned out because we are too embarrassed to acknowledge and learn from. By bringing these issues to light, Cuarón tries to reach those in his audience that have the luxury of tuning these horrors of society out and attempts to stimulate this moral awakening in them by forcing them to experience the consequences of our current trajectory through a possible dystopian future. In conclusion, the film's message clearly states that perfect utopia will never exist, and neither will pure dystopia. Instead, due to the inevitable divide in ideologies and beliefs, society will always be a mix of both. However, the interdependent relationship of the classes is what defines society. The bourgeoisie help maintain peace and control, preventing the basic constitution of civilization from falling apart and emerging into anarchy. The proletariat help build the underlying foundations of a society and help balance the social and economic hierarchy. Through the films, we get to see two futures, one projecting the fears of humanity as class isolation escalates, second depicting the chaotic implications starting a revolution would have on civilization. However, in the end, the films present a final ultimatum or a solution, the unity of the classes and their acceptance of one another.